14 days, a fortnight on, there's no turning back for Vladimir Putin, whose ground forces have progressed in stops and starts while shelling Ukrainian cities and the trapped civilians inside. We're going to try to cut through the fog of war and ask if it's going to plan for the Kremlin. For Ukrainians, it's a blunt choice of fight or flee. We'll get the latest both inside the country and among NATO allies who've made it clear they're not putting boots on the ground, but continue to step up support. Is it enough to hold out? There's also the ground war, but there's also the information war. For most here, it's David versus Goliath, right in the heart of Europe. For the Kremlin, it's further proof that the West's bent on undermining Russia in its own backyard. With war and sanctions inflicting pain all around, who has the stronger resolve? Today in the France 24 debate, we are asking if Ukraine can hold out. And we're joined from the southern port city of Odessa by Hannah Shelest, Director of Security Programs at the Foreign Policy Council Ukraine Prism. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Good evening.
We want to also welcome to the show Tom Southern, who joins us from London, Director of Special Projects at the Center for Information Resilience. Tell us what the Center for Information Resilience is.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. So we're a not-for-profit entity in the UK that specialises in identifying and countering threats to democracies. So that incorporates all things, including disinformation, information operations, and influence operations, of which, of course, the Kremlin has been somewhat of a master for some time, but is perhaps failing now.
Failing now, you say. We'll pick up on that point, perhaps, in a little bit. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Let's start with the very latest. The city council in the besieged port city of Mariupol claiming that Russian airstrikes have completely destroyed the maternity wing of the city's children's hospital. Earlier, we were on the line with the deputy mayor of that city. And he said to us, Hannah Shelest, that for him it was obvious that this was done on purpose. Your thoughts?
I absolutely agree with him, because that is not a small house in some suburbs that you could miss with the military base or with some equipment. As you could see from photos and videos, that is quite a big complex of buildings of the hospitals, and definitely not new buildings. They've been there even at the Soviet maps. So if they have the outdated maps, it's still the hospital being there. And you saw the extreme damages that are being there. So it is not one missile that accidentally changed the route, for example, or something like this. It means that the heavy shelling been happening. So definitely you can clarify it only as the war crime, but not as the accidental collateral damage.
And this is a modus operandi we've seen where Russia's been involved in other places, in Chechnya, in Syria. What's the mood where you are in Odessa on this?
Odessa, you know, that's really quite a surreal feeling, because now we are talking in comparing with the other parts of Ukraine. And each morning I answer my friends, we are okay, we are safe, even that we hear the sirens of the air defense each few hours and hear the work of the air defense. But when I talk with my friends in Kharkiv, in Kherson, or in Kiev, I definitely feel myself much safer here as for now, because we don't have target against the city itself, only from the sea and some of the suburbs. But what you said about modus operandi, I completely agree with you, because as for now, Ukraine already confirmed that more than 200 schools and more than 60 hospitals being targeted and destroyed in Ukraine. You can imagine that such big numbers, especially that the hospitals are properly marked, that's deliberate actions to make people panicking and to surrender, rather than to have the special operation as the Russian leadership pretend.
Tom Southern, what have you been able to piece together as to what's been happening on the ground the last couple of days? Is it indiscriminate shelling? What have you found?
So yes, we undertake a lot of verification of the footage that's provided by the social media world and people on the ground. And as best we can tell, there does seem to be a great level of indiscriminate shelling, as has been proven in Mariupol, or perhaps that is discriminate in the sense that they were targeting it. And I believe the WHO has come out and said that at least 18 medical facilities and medical personnel have been targeted in their estimations. In ours, it's certainly more than that, and our verified data would suggest that it is more than that. And in and of itself, that constitutes a war crime, but as does the targeting of other civilian infrastructure. And there is definitely an element of the way that Russian forces use their weapons. Some of them are very laser targeted. Some of them are still quite analog, for want of a better word, and can only really be used indiscriminately because they're just not accurate enough. And so they are using both, and it is having a severe impact on the civilian population still.
At the other end of the country from Mariupol, we can show you the map of the front lines. There's the disaffected Chernobyl nuclear power plant taken by the Russians in the early days of the fighting. Ukraine earlier called for a ceasefire to repair a power line to the site of the 1986 nuclear disaster. The state energy company Energoatom says that radioactive substances could be released if the plant cannot cool spent nuclear fuel. The foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, saying reserve diesel generators can power the plant for only 48 hours. Earlier he tweeted an appeal to the international community to urgently demand Russia to cease fire and allow repair units to restore power supply. Tom Southern, our correspondent in Vienna, who monitors things at the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, saying there's no reason to panic for now when it comes to Chernobyl. But what happened earlier, or this power outage, a reminder that the front lines are crossing other nuclear power plants, and that is high on the minds of everyone around the world right now.
As it absolutely should be, and as this sort of is typical of the Kremlin sort of blasé attitude towards how civilians might be affected by this kind of thing. Obviously, downstream as well, people be worried about their supply chains in terms of sort of the energy and the fuel that they can get. But realistically, what we have to worry about most is those that are going to be affected in the near environment. And quite understandably, if you live by any of these, you're going to be terrified that it's going to release sort of any kind of nuclear material. And Russia feels that it has the upper hand in this. The Kremlin feels it has the upper hand in this because it can go so much further than others are willing to. So it can threaten these plants, and understandably, others might want to sort of row back and let them take them, or perhaps sort of make some kind of deal about them, because we're not willing to let sort of nuclear material escape, whereas they are. And I should add that the Kremlin doesn't care about what happens to its soldiers in these environments as well. So these soldiers might get contaminated by radiation. The Kremlin doesn't care. That's part of its strategy.
Kremlin doesn't care, you say. On the road from the captured city of Kherson to the southern port of Odessa is Mykolaiv. It's a flashpoint, and it was visited by France 24's Gwendoline Dubonneau in this report read by Alexander Alcott.
Visiting some of the wounded at this hospital, we can get a better idea of what it means to fight in a city that the Russians consider strategic. These Ukrainian soldiers had a miraculous escape when a Russian cruise missile fell on their base at the edge of the city. But many of their brothers in arms were not so lucky.
Обломки на другий поверх, тобто там, де ми були. З другого поверху я опинився на першому поверху. Та ні, все добре, да. Все добре.
Русский корабль пошел.
Since the start of the offensive, 160 soldiers have been admitted, but most of the casualties have been civilians, like this woman who lives in a village where the Russians have managed to get a foothold.
А они там и танки, и БТРы, и теперь они там всех людей, ну кушать хочется, всех обчищают, самолеты летят, бомблять их.
Russian forces have been targeting civilian areas as they hope to capture the strategic town that connects Kiev to Odessa. A rocket hit this building, located near an airbase, but the young people inside don't intend to evacuate.
Спали, в 5 утра проснулись от вспышек. Соседи были в шоке, дети, все было. И как раз первый взрыв был в дом, как раз начало трясти, сыпаться штукатурка. Честно говоря, ну тут будет просто...
Even if life has been turned upside down since the Russian invasion began, the residents of Mykolaiv are well aware that the worst is yet to come.
Hannah Shelest, I'm struck by what you said earlier about people in Odessa every day waking up and seeing that the city's okay and that there hasn't been fighting yet where you are. On Tuesday, we spoke to a deputy mayor of your city, and he was saying to us, well, you're going to have to first get through Mariupol. You're going to have to first get through cities like Mykolaiv, which we just saw in that report, before you get to us. He was perhaps sounding an optimistic note, saying it would be later rather than sooner that there would be a siege of Odessa. What are people telling you where you are?
Yes, exactly. Odessa is the base for the Navy of Ukraine. So we have quite a support from the sea, and we've been expecting the landing operation from the ships. That's why beaches in Odessa being mined heavily. But to come from the sea, you also need the land support. And to have this land support, you need either to occupy the whole territory from Ukraine to Odessa, and that is 500 kilometers, that luckily now under the Ukrainian control, or to come from Crimea through Mykolaiv. That's why these 100 kilometers that we have between Mykolaiv and Odessa are so important now to protect. And that's why for Odessa people, we are watching the news from Mykolaiv each day, each hour, very attentively, because we understand that our security depends on them. But at the same time, Russians have the additional forces just on the west from Odessa. 50 kilometers from here, we have the unrecognized Transnistria, the Moldovan separatist district, where Russians have 1,500 forces and limited capacity, but still of some ammunitions like tanks and helicopters. So de facto, Odessa can be open from three sides as for now. But at the same time, when you have only one route open, that is not sufficient to occupy Odessa or to start any military operation. We even talked with the military historians in Odessa, and they said that for the whole history, there were only two maritime landing operations in 1919 and 1941, and both happened only with the strong support from the land. Otherwise, all other operations being completely unsuccessful.
And you've been preparing. There's a statue of a Frenchman that residents of Odessa have been defending. Sandbags surrounding the bronze statue of Armand Emmanuel Duplessis, Duke of Richelieu, who fought for the Tsars and was appointed as governor of the Pearl of the Black Sea, as Odessa is known, back in 1803. These images, something else. Hannah Shelest, tell us more about what the morale is like where you are.
People are quite determined. One of the biggest Russian mistakes being that they underestimated Ukrainian population. They thought about such towns as Kharkiv and Odessa that because we are Russian-speaking, we should be pro-Russian. That's been a huge mistake and miscalculations on the ground, because what we definitely saw that for people, their land, their peace, their daily life is so important that they don't want what they see from Russia. It's not only the destructions that people saw in Donbass previously or in some other places where Russians came, but also the way of life that we see in Russia without any democracy or human rights or freedom. And freedom for people in Odessa is extremely important. That's why what we see now, I see, for example, the chef of my favorite restaurant, together with all his staff, they are cooking daily 500 lunches for the armed forces. I see how the millionaire, the local businessman, the owner of the seaport, is spending all his time, efforts, and money to support the territorial defense. I see how my colleagues from the university joined the armed forces, or how many others are volunteering around the town and helping to protect it as much as they can. So that is definitely the mood inside. There are certain panic among some part of population. Let's be honest, when you see the pictures of destructions in Kharkiv or in Chernihiv, it's difficult not to be panicking. So mothers with small kids are also trying to evacuate to Moldova, to Romania, because it is very close to us. But I can't say that that is massive or it is the same situation as what you see in Lviv. But at the same time, it is so strange to see the empty Odessa in the beginning of March, because usually it is the time when all cafes are opening their street tables and people are taking their coffee outside. And now walking in downtown, I see the empty city. That's something that probably you can see here only on the 1st of January.
1st of January. And Hannah, you know, forgive me for asking this, but there are these purported lists of people that the Russians want to take out if they do manage to capture these major cities. Is that something that's on your mind?
Journalists are asking this question all the time. Honestly, I try not to think about this. First of all, because panicking and depression, it is probably the last thing to have in this situation. Because if we would be depressed and panicking, we will not be able to work and to do as much as we can together with our armed forces. At the same time, I've been in many conflict zones because of my profession in the past. So morally, I'm probably a little bit more prepared, even that as the individual, as the citizen, it's impossible to be prepared to such tragic events, but still I'm trying to think rational, first of all, about the situation. The second, it's probably quite a late for me to hide, considering that I'm quite a public person. And for Russians, if they have a target, who knows how it goes. But still, when you are in your own city with your family, you have the feeling of safety and of certain assurance and determination. And that's really important. That's what keeps a lot of my colleagues still being in the city and trying to prepare for the best.
Tom Southern, let me ask you, when you look now, it's been 2 weeks, as we said at the outset. Do you have the feeling that this is going to plan or not when it comes to what the Russians intended to do?
I can't see how it could have gone less to plan at this point. I think there were a number of military miscalculations that were made, but there were also a huge number of information miscalculations that were made. And partially it comes down to sort of how the Kremlin presents itself to itself as this sort of power that is liberating Ukraine, a country that didn't require liberation and certainly wouldn't require it from Putin's Russia at this point. But it also comes to how they thought they were going to be received in Ukraine. And ultimately, what has happened is that the soldiers that they've sent in, who were conscripts a couple of weeks ago, many of whom have been sort of forced into signing up as full-time members of the military, have found that the lies they were told about Ukraine being currently occupied by Nazis, about Ukraine being ready to welcome Russians with open arms, and so on, was completely fabricated. And as such, they've met with fierce resistance. They expected to be welcomed with open arms, but they've been welcomed with Molotov cocktails. This isn't what they were expecting, and it's not what they were prepared for. And there is this sort of big question about Russian logistics in terms of everybody's talking about the convoy that's obviously moving towards Kiev, and whether or not that was just a matter of a failure of planning. There seems to certainly have been an element to that. There have been a number of people who have suggested that it can come down to things as basic as not having the right kind of tires, that there was some kind of problem in procurement, and they bought these knockoff cheap Chinese tires when they should have bought sort of Michelin or something. And similarly, that they didn't provide them with enough fuel to begin with. All of those things we should bear in mind, whilst it is obviously, for those of us who are on the side of Ukraine, somewhat pleasing to see the Russians fail in that regard. These things are surmountable with enough time, and so we should be on our guard to some degree. If the Russians get their act together, if they do get their logistics in, then that suddenly becomes a very different calculation. But there are a number of things that also haven't gone to plan. Their air war hasn't necessarily gone to plan. Obviously, it's very easy to say that from London. I'm not being shelled here, and everybody in Ukraine obviously is suffering a great deal from the shelling and the airstrikes. However, the Ukrainian army has been very, very adept at targeting the Russian Air Force, and particularly its helicopters. But it's also been very adept at using new technology, such as the Bayraktar drones, to target the supply routes. So the trucks that are carrying the fuel and the diesel, which aren't armored. And so there's certainly a lot more at play than the Kremlin expected, both from sort of a logistics and a military perspective, but also, as I say, from this sort of hearts and minds perspective, that they just weren't prepared, or they'd lied to themselves for so long that when they arrived, the reality really hit them and prevented them from actually making the full-scale advances that they thought they would make so quickly. As I say, they were planning for a quick war. They weren't prepared for a long war, but they do have the resources in the long term to keep going for one. And whilst, say, around 10%, I think, is the estimate of their equipment has been destroyed, or at least their military assets, that does still leave 90% of their assets, which are pretty significant. But the Ukrainians have done an incredible job, far more than anyone would expect, particularly without sort of the wider scale air support that they might have asked for, indeed have asked for. They've done incredibly well.
Done incredibly well. You mentioned conscripts at the outset. This Wednesday, the Russian government, just one day after President Putin said there were no conscripts in Ukraine, admitting not only that they were there, but that some had been captured by the Ukrainians.
Unfortunately, we have discovered the presence of several conscripts in units taking part in the special military operation in Ukraine. Practically all such soldiers have now been pulled out to Russia. At the same time, one of the units carrying out logistics operations was attacked by a sabotage group of a national battalion. A number of servicemen, including conscripts, were captured. Comprehensive measures are currently being taken to prevent the conscripts from being sent to combat areas and to have the captured servicemen released.
Well, also in London, alongside Tom Southern, is Nikolay Petrov, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, the think tank, Professor of Political Science at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. This admission that there are conscripts on the battlefield, will that make an impact or not for Russian public opinion?
I think it will not play any significant role now. Partly due to the fact that even initially the idea was that some of conscripts were forced to ask for the contract service just before invading Ukraine. So that's how they've been transformed into contract soldiers. But partly this is due to the fact that the government entirely controls all the information which is coming from Ukraine. They do avoid showing any images which can be negatively perceived by the population, and there are no more alternative sources of information. And if Russian citizens who still do support this military operation are eager to live in an imagined world, the government is doing its best to let them to think that their army is liberating Ukraine brothers from Nazis.
Yeah, and we heard the foreign ministry spokesperson earlier in the day, again calling it, as is the law there, you're not allowed to call it an invasion, a special military operation, and each day bringing claims from the Kremlin to justify the attack.
We confirm we discovered facts during a special military operation in Ukraine, demonstrating an urgent purge of military biological programs of the Kiev regime. They were realized by Kiev with financial support of the United States. Of course, it's nothing to do with the peaceful use for scientific purposes for peace and development.
So, Nikolay Petrov, is this what you're referring to?
Yes, I am referring to these, as well as to the fact that the very idea to call it military operation instead of invasion, the war, is not only connected to psychological reasons, but according to Russian laws, in case of military operation, the Ministry of Defense should not report about losses, and moreover, it's secret, and that's why it's much easier to hide any real information about how Russian army is doing in Ukraine.
Tom Southern, your remit, as you told us at the outset, is to counter disinformation. How do you do it when a country has shut down Twitter, shut down a lot of the social media coming from the outside world, and as you've just heard it explained by Nikolay, is keeping a tight lid on what you can say or not say?
It absolutely is, and that's been sort of always the challenge in Russia. It's got worse, obviously, as you suggested there, from some of the shutdowns. the older population is particularly difficult to reach, not least because their primary sources of information, or indeed disinformation in this regard, is the state-run television. However, the younger population, though some of the social media has been shut down, are far more adept at accessing through VPNs or through other sort of newer technology this kind of information. And there is some acknowledgement and definitely some concern about that in the Kremlin, because if we go into those sort of channels, Telegram's a very good example, where young Russians are, we are seeing a lot of fake accounts, as they used to on Facebook or as they used to on Twitter, appearing that are pushing the pro-Kremlin narrative. And they only would do that if they were genuinely concerned that people are accessing the truth, for want of a better word. And it is clear that people are accessing the truth in Russia, because the number of protests that we're seeing and the scale of the number of protests that we're seeing and the number of arrests they've had to make, everything from a 7-year-old to a 77-year-old, means that there are people out there that are accessing the truth. And be that from social media, be that from their friends and family, even though the Kremlin has this sort of very tight noose on it, it can't keep it completely controlled forever. And that genuinely terrifies them.
Genuinely terrifies them. What about how it's spun here in the West? We've seen the shutdown of RT, the Russian broadcaster, in many Western countries. Still, are the Russians able to get their message out in this direction?
So they are, and they have been. It's interesting to see that the change has actually been that people just don't believe the messaging anymore. It's become too fantastical, and perhaps the reality of what they've been doing and what we can see that they're doing, due to the amount of verifiable, true information, has sort of come and broken the spell they might have had previously. But we shouldn't underestimate it. They are definitely still pushing their messaging, but they just can't do it through their usual channels. The other thing that's sort of happened to them in the West in particular is a number of their useful idiots that many of whom they helped to get elected into parliaments across Europe, are no longer speaking up for them. They don't have that sort of backing amongst the sort of elected offices that they used to. Every country we can think of, France obviously has, Le Pen was one of them for a long time, but many more across Europe are suddenly now turning against the Kremlin, which means that it's much more difficult for them to provide the message that they would do sort of on social media more holistically through things like politicians. I would say as well, though, that they are adapting their strategy. And so instead of perhaps pushing quite as much effort as they did on the West, there does seem to be a lot more effort in pushing disinformation or propaganda narratives in parts of Africa and parts of Asia and India. And that appears to be in part to keep those countries neutral, where possible, to shore up sort of the Kremlin and its oligarchs' assets in those countries, so that they can weather the storm at the moment that's going on against them in Europe, particularly on the sanctions regime. And we've seen that a lot in, as I say, sort of India, in Uganda, in Nigeria, a number of other countries as well. And that's only happened sort of relatively recently off the back of their previous disinformation efforts over there. So it's something that we need to keep an eye on.
And so far, it's still effective in places like you say, like India, like Nigeria, like other parts of Africa?
It can be. It very much depends on the country and the infrastructure itself and whether anybody's pushing back on them. And a lot of countries, not just in Africa or Asia or anywhere else, don't have necessarily the infrastructure. And it often comes down to civil society organizations like myself there to help out with them. So if there isn't anybody pushing back on it, it's very difficult for people to see what the truth is, entirely understandably. And so it does vary quite a lot.
Nikolay Petrov, what hurts more right now? Is it, again, we've talked about it, the sanctions, the fact, or is it things like the fact that these Western companies have pulled out of Moscow, no longer having McDonald's, which was synonymous with glasnost in its day, no longer having Pepsi Cola, whose relationship with Russia dates back to the 1970s. Does that matter, or just inside the Moscow and St. Petersburg bubble?
It matters a lot, and for the first time, those sanctions which are implemented are felt almost immediately by ordinary Russians. Not only there is huge inflation, and we should wait for unemployment because many enterprises are closed, and although Russian government is saying that they will be taken under control of the government, almost nationalized. It's understandable that a lot of Russians are losing and will losing their jobs. So I would say that now we do have active minority, which is loudly opposing the war due to political reasons. But the share of those who are already feeling negative economic consequences is increasing, and plus to more information coming from Ukraine about what's going on there and about losses in Russian army, we should wait for the wave of much more negative attitude with regard to the war, which puts Putin into very, very limited time span. So he's very limited in time, and he should do whatever he can in order to finish the operation in a short while.
Limited in time, or is this a chance for him to say, see, I told you, the West is out to get us, time to rally round the flag?
Well, it did work, and we've already seen that at the beginning of the war, his popularity and the level of his support did increase somehow, but it was at a time when the cost of the war wasn't felt. You know, like in case of annexation of Crimea, Putin has been applauded, and a big part of the story is that it was taken without any cost from the point of view of average Russians who did support this annexation.
The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has now landed in Turkey. On Thursday, he'll be sitting down with his Ukrainian counterpart. There's very slim chances, what with all the ceasefire violations we've seen over the past 2 weeks, for any kind of a breakthrough in the meeting that will take place in Antalya. Still ahead of it, we paid attention to a Wednesday interview by Ukraine's president with U.S. broadcaster ABC News, Volodymyr Zelensky, softening his stance regarding Kyiv's application for NATO membership. He said, quote, that I have cooled down regarding this question a long time ago after we understood that NATO is not prepared to accept Ukraine. The alliance is afraid of controversial things and confrontation with Russia. In the same interview, Zelensky reducing demands on the occupied Donbass, asking for assurances, he says, for Ukrainians living in those Russian-backed separatist areas. I think that that items regarding temporarily occupied territories and pseudo-republics not recognized by anyone but Russia, we can discuss and find a compromise on how these territories will live on. Hannah Shelest, what's reaction to the Ukrainian president talking about compromises?
Compromises are different, and when he spoke about NATO, it doesn't mean that Ukraine is rejecting the idea that we would like to be a NATO member. He just expressed the disappointment that definitely in this situation we expected much more from NATO itself as the guarantee of security in Europe, as the Ukraine currently, you should not forget, is the enhanced opportunity partner of NATO. So definitely we expected a little bit more, but NATO demonstrated some limited capacities probably at this situation. That's why he said about this cooling, but it's not only up to the president to decide about the future NATO integration, because now it is in our constitution, and you need to change the constitution to change the foreign policy path. When you spoke about the so-called DNR and LNR, the separate districts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, the compromise always been discussed about the possible elections or the special status and so on. The problem is that the Russian-controlled proxies there been all the time demanding the things that you can't find even in the, not federation, but in confederation. They wanted to have their own prosecutors. their own militia, their own security forces, and to control foreign and security policy of the country, of the whole country. So that's why usually all those discussions previously been it been a stale block, but also because they wanted elections in the times when they couldn't guarantee security on the ground, and they couldn't guarantee the right for 2 million of internally displaced people to participate in those elections. Now, as we understand from the different statement the president is doing, that he's ready to return again to the negotiations about the special status of those territories, because it seems to me that now some of the people living there, looking at what is happening within these 2 weeks, they also can reconsider their positions about the Russian Federation or about their future as the independent entities, not supported by anybody, but also completely economically dependent on Russia, because Russia destroyed the economy of these territories, and they are not the places that will be able to have the self-sufficient economy or something like this. But that is the compromise that can be discussed. The question is what is there. If for Russia compromise mean Ukraine to trade off its sovereignty and territorial integrity, that's definitely not the compromise that Ukraine would be willing to even to negotiate.
All right, and the chances of those of some kind of compromise fast seem for the moment slim. Public opinion, we've talked about public opinion in Russia. Just a word on public opinion in the West. Well, obviously it firmly supports Ukraine. You heard earlier how Tom Southern was saying how those who are even pro-Putin have had to change their stance. Too soon to say how that support will stand the test of time. What with inflation over the long haul, there's going to be higher prices all around. Citizens will be going, how the public opinion here goes is still a matter up for question. One battleground in that information war is younger people. This young girl going viral with her posts on life during wartime. That's just one example, Hannah Celeste, and yeah, she got a lot of followers on TikTok for that. Let me ask you, because earlier you heard we were talking about you were saying how Odessa is a Russian-speaking city. So you're in an area where, when it comes to the information war, you get it from both sides. What's the feeling as far as the way the rest of the world is watching it from your vantage point?
First, a short brief about the inflation or higher prices for the Europe. It seems to me that now Europe is paying this price because it was afraid to pay at least some small price for the 8 years of the Russian invasion and occupation of Crimea and Donbass. So that's probably very cynical from our side, but that's definitely the situation that when somebody wanted to neglect the security threat in the middle of Europe, now you are witnessing together with us the much greater consequences. But in terms of information that we are receiving here, you know, before 2014, a lot of people have been watching Russian TV here or following some websites. For the last 8 years, you have a minimum of population who are doing it. And it's not only because the Russian TV channels been banned in Ukraine many years ago, but also because the propaganda there became so mad and so odd. That's probably the best word, because people saw what is on the ground and they heard what is in the news, that a lot of people just stopped watching it. The entertainment content of Ukrainian TV was completely okay, if not the better. And we had access to different types of the media. You want more pro-right, more pro-left of this politician or of that politician. So it's quite a diversity of the information channels in Ukraine. That's why the Russian TV became completely not interesting for citizens, not only of Odessa, but of many cities that are Russian speakers. In the social networks, you still have a certain amount, because the Russian Telegram channels, for example, or some groups been trying to promote the information. But we can say that it's mostly worked as the covert operations when you needed to throw certain narrative. Still, we've been doing for several years annual research in Ukraine, asking the people agreement to certain Russian narratives. And the results was very good, because for the last 2 years, I noticed that even in Odessa, the level of agreement with the Russian narratives been decreasing, significantly decreasing. And people were not buying even the most popular narratives that Russians been spreading about Ukraine, about our foreign policy choice, about Russian language, because one of the favorite Russian narrative is that Russian-speaking population have problems in Ukraine, that they are punished or they have some security issues. When the city of 1 million people speak in Russian in their daily life, it is very difficult to sell them the idea that they are prosecuted in some kind of way because they are speaking Russian.
All right, so hammering home the point that was made at the outset by Tom about the disinformation war not going the way of the Kremlin. Hannah Shelest in Odessa, many thanks for being with us. Our thoughts with the people of Ukraine in these difficult times. I want to thank as well Nikolay Petrov and Tom Southern for being with us from London. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.